KCPC are jointly doing. Last year we presented on climate finance, and we are focusing on adaptation finance, the status of climate finance, key issues for Africa. A brief overview on the content. First, we essentially discuss the issues in adaptation finance, the African context, the recent adaptation costs, adaptation finance for Africa, proposals to generate climate finance, etc. So, what is the entire thing which is going on at the moment? In fact, we've just heard that Korea, of course, has come in as the place where the GCF will be based out of. Okay, the other one is, what are the methods to raise finance for adaptation? So we have to essentially get into the nature of finance for climate action, especially adaptation. Adaptation and mitigation are different beasts, and they have to be probably tackled differently with respect to the kind of financial instruments and sources which tackle these two. The interaction of business and financial models in implementing adaptation or sustainable development projects. This is a very interesting thing which probably we have learned a lot from the implementation action which Terry has undertaken not only in India but also in Africa with a project called the Lighter Billion Lives campaign. Finally, we do a kind of a reality check, which is the climate finance flows into developing countries in 2009-10. So what is exactly the status? And finally, we end with the key strategies and options for African negotiators. Very quickly, these are the adaptation cost estimates, which most of us are kind of familiar with. The World Bank 2010 is probably the most useful number, 75 billion to 100 billion per annum. And most people now think that it is a huge underestimate, especially with two things which have been talked about in the session just before. Number one was, is the UNFCCC mechanism working, or doubts have been raised with respect to that. And the second question was, when are we peaking? So are we looking at a 2-degree world, or are we looking at a 4-degree world? 4-degree world, adaptation costs dramatically increase, so we'll take care of that. These are the cost estimates for Africa. There is a huge variance, but as you can see, every new study comes up with a higher benchmark, just like we saw in the previous slide as well. Every new study, every year, the adaptation costs are escalating. This is true for Africa as well. Now let's see what has actually happened. If you look at the row over here, it is essentially the amount pledged. It's $3,000 million, which is exactly $3 billion. So we were looking at sums of, say, around $100 billion globally, $30 billion for Africa. The actual amount which is pledged is around $3 billion, so it's 1/10 of that. The amount approved for Sub-Saharan Africa is again 1/10 of that. And then the actual disbursed is just $100 million. So we are very far away from what is the amount of money which requires to be spent. So what do we do? These are the kind of proposals which have been floating around. Most of them kind of agree or align with the AGF report, where the late Prime Minister Meles also played a very crucial part in bringing that report with 5 sources and 8 instruments. But none of these things are on the anvil yet. The closest one was the bunker fuels, which got not a warm reception at Durban. We all know that. So there is nothing on the anvil with respect to that. But what is definitely there on the anvil is investment grade finance. Now, I will come to why making adaptation and investment grade finance. There are actually 5 reasons, and I have not written that here because there was a constraint on the number of slides, but I will tell you that. The 5 reasons why making adaptation finance investment grade is: number 1, investment grade finance is the most available form of finance. Second, even if all the pledges are kept, the actual amount of money which is required for adaptation cannot be met by concessionary finance, as he has pointed out as well. We require to get into the source of finance which is most widely available. Third thing is, making investment grade finance available actually lowers transaction costs. If you look at CDM, though we call it a market mechanism, it is not really a market mechanism. A market is where buyers and sellers come together out of their own free will. Here the sellers have come out of their free will, but the buyers are not. They have been forced into it. So if you look at it, it's basically a kind of taxation, maybe an efficient tax, but it's not really a market mechanism. It's a form of taxation where the demand is exogenous. Now, how do you make demand endogenous? How do you make people want buy climate products? That's we will come to in the next slide. So lowest transaction cost. Fourth is different ideas are tried out. It's basically the animal spirits, etc. That if you have different funding sources, different ideas will get implemented. You can negotiate not only to one kind of fund giver, but you can negotiate with different kinds of fund givers. And fifth is it's very good macroeconomics. Investment grade finance takes care of inflationary pressures. It also takes care of exchange rate fluctuations. So investment grade finance is what adaptation should really look at. There are some good reasons for doing that. The next is risk management for mobilizing finance for adaptation. Yes, risk management is required, but I don't want to go into it because of time constraints. The characterization of risk for adaptation is extremely important. There are two kinds of things: implementation risk and a consequential risk. Our paper has dealt with more, so if you can look at the paper, it deals with more efficiently. I just want to leave with two things. Real options is a very interesting financial method by which adaptation can be funded. I don't want to explain it, but I just want to leave you with these two words, real options, and maybe the paper will explain it more. And the role of financial gradients. Last year we talked about financial gradients, where you know how financial indicators can be brought up on sustainable development projects or adaptation projects, and we can track it real time, whether good work is being done or not, whether what has been promised is happening or not, and financial indicators are being met up. So this essentially lowers transaction costs. There's a next slide which I want to show. I don't want to explain the full diagram, but I want to explain two things. A, I've separated the business model and the financial model. I've also separated two things. This is the project level and the program level. The reason behind that is something like this. Business model essentially takes care of the product. Are you using a particular product or not? Okay. Whether you're willing to pay for it or whether you're able to pay for it is a different question. The financial model looks at how that product can be financed. Not a good example, but an example nonetheless is Google. Every time we search on Google, we are using something, but we are not paying for it. Somebody else is. Most people think of it as advertising, but it's not actually advertising because no space is sold on Google. What is actually sold is the number of words you type on Google. So it's a very different thing. In fact, Google took 7 years to figure out how to generate revenue for Google. So there are very innovative ideas for financial models and separating the business model from the financial model. So if you can do some good work, there can be a financial model which addresses that. For adaptation, I want to say one thing, which is, say, de-risk financial instruments. There is an endogenous demand for de-risking financial instruments. There are many papers on this. So, but no one is forcing the insurance companies or the private companies or the private sector power companies to buy de-risk financial instruments, which is basically adaptive capacity building. But essentially, it's an endogenous demand. That demand will be there. So yes, you can provide good electricity, good water, food security, etc. But the end consumers don't have to pay for it. Somebody else does. So that's the separation of the business models and the financial models. Also, in adaptation and sustainable development action, we separate the project level and the program level. More on this in the paper. Last, a reality check. So in 2009 and 10, what has been the kind of investment flows which has come into climate action? If you see, majority of it is actually investment grade finance, whether it is private finance or bank, which is debt, whether it's a multilateral bank or development banks, they basically give you debt, so which is investment grade finance. This is a paper by Buchner. They basically did the study. They found 80% of all money which is flowed into climate finance was investment grade. They tracked around $98 billion. And guess how much was there for adaptation? 94 was for mitigation, 4 billion was for adaptation. So we have seen two things. Number one is, even if all the pledges are met, the finance from pledges is not going to help the cause. We also see that globally, for climate action, it is investment grade finance which is the overwhelming majority. Adaptation has not really figured out an investment grade pathway for itself. So what are the three strategic options for African negotiators? Number one, yes, we do require, pledge finance, which is extremely important. Raising funds have to be in line. Your PDDs, etc., project design documents have to be in line, much like the mitigation happened. And then finally, offering a pipeline of projects, extremely important. The only thing I want to end with is mitigation, you can outsource, offshore, etc. Adaptation, every plot of land in this planet requires to adapt. There is no offshoring, no adapting. There is no way we can wait for negotiation outcomes for that. In fact, our negotiation has to happen keeping in line how we can start adaptation work right now. Okay, what is required right now, make those pipeline of projects. Thank you.
Thank you very much.